Welcome, everybody, to the Frontline Podcast. This is the official KARDS Podcast, but we're doing something a little bit different this week. You may notice the absence of my regular co-host, Elin. We are going to be celebrating the new Brothers in Arms expansion here today. It is releasing on June 27th. In fact, by the time this podcast drops, those of you who pre-ordered the expansion may have gotten your grubby little fingers on it, testing things out. So this might be a bit of a refresher for you, but for some folks, this might be the first time seeing and getting to theory craft with some of these cards. I am joined by Keli from 1939 Games, going to walk us through a little bit of the background of this expansion. We got Jking, we got Birdo. They're familiar faces. You've seen them across cards, esports, whether competing or casting. We're going to dive deep into their brains and understand where these cards might slot into some of your deck building shenanigans you're going to do over the next coming weeks and months. So action-packed show, lots going on. Before we get too far, a little bit of housekeeping though. We do have the expansion dropping on the 27th officially. Now, originally we had the introduction of the reserve pool and 90 cards were going to move over on the 23rd of June. That's getting pushed back. So full release of the Brothers in Arms expansion on the 27th. And the reserve pool is going to happen on the 27th as well. So that's all happening all at once. Keli, do you want to walk us through just a quick explanation of the change around moving the reserve pool back from the 23rd to the 27th?
Yeah, hi guys, thanks for having me back again. We are of course doing this for the first time and sort of figuring things along the way, of course. But so the original plan was to have this go out on the 23rd to make sure that the new cards and the reserved cards wouldn't mix at all. That was the thinking. But then when we started to think about it a bit more, it would mean that for the days between the 23rd and until the release on the 27th, there would be sort of this gap where we would have removed a lot of cards from people, but only some people would have some of the new cards. So it would create this sort of strange void. So we felt it was better to rather allow people a little bit of time to play around with both the new cards and the reserved cards, and then do the whole change on the 27th.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying that. So it makes a lot of sense. Everybody gets access to the new cards and the old cards all go away all at the same time. Now, diving into the expansion, we talked a little bit on a previous podcast around the background around Brothers in Arms and that whole concept. But something I wanted to dive deeper into was the actual veteran keyword. Now, something new, kind of a new function as well, where you're sort of flipping from one card to an evolution of that card almost. So, Keli, can you walk us through maybe a bit around how that idea came to fruition and how it was implemented?
We actually have talked about for a long time internally about wanting to do a mechanic that allowed cards to change into different cards or different versions of themselves or something like that. And once the theme for this expansion started to sort of come together, the idea came about to use this mechanic. We felt it would fit well into this focus on sort of the soldiers themselves and their journey through fighting in a war, and having them become veteran felt very thematic, but also explained the mechanic very well. And this is what a lot of card games have been playing around with similar ideas. This is especially easy to do in a digital card game, but even physical card games have been toying around with a lot of sort of transformative mechanics in recent years. So it's something that we know a lot of people enjoy, and the big appeal to us was this. That it created this sort of strategic urgency for players, where you see the enemy has played out a card that can become a very powerful version of itself if it gets time, so it sort of gives you this strategic choice of how important is it for me to deal with this veteran unit before it becomes veteran, or kind of just ignore it and bypass it, and so we felt it was a very interesting strategic decision making there. In terms of the mechanic itself, we toyed around a bit with exactly how it would work out, especially in terms of um, what is the state of the card when it becomes veteran? Would it retain the damage it had on? Would it retain buffs that had been given to it? Would it retain being pinned and so on? And we tried out various different versions, and we felt that the best version is the one we are going for, is where we basically reset the stats to the new veteran stats, which often are a bit different from the original ones. But any sort of external states like pin or effects from like surplus shortage and so on would still apply to the card. That was the sort of ideal setup in terms of it definitely made the veteran cards automatically more powerful because you're effectively healing the card. But we felt this was something that was an important appeal to the cards as a whole. It would feel very lame if you get this awesome veteran unit, but it only has 1 health left and dies immediately. It didn't feel very, very cool.
Well, especially since a few of them require, let's say killing a unit to be able to flip, and all of a sudden you kill a unit, have 1 health left, and you get picked off. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I am curious now from a player's perspective, and we're going to flip over to Jking and Berto here, but I'm going to ask the question in a bit of a roundabout way, because we did before the show ask the two of you to provide a list of, some interesting cards you'd like to dive into and talk about, and neither of you picked a single veteran card, I don't believe. So I'm curious, and Jking, we can start with you. When you first saw the keyword and you saw the implementation of it on some cards, were you underwhelmed? Were you just distracted by other cards, which is why you didn't put it on this list that we were going to pull up a little bit later? Kind of what was your first initial reaction to the keyword?
So I really like the keyword. I think it's very, very interesting. But I sort of see it in the same way I saw Pincer when Pincer first came out, in that it's a very interesting keyword and it's implemented in very different and interesting ways. However, I think there's not really enough to make a dedicated Pincer deck at when Pincer first came out. And since then we have seen, especially in this expansion, and I know Birdo picked a card that we'll get into later that sort of supports that, making Pincer a more dedicated theme. So there is some veteran cards that maybe you could build a veteran deck around it. But for now, I mostly see veteran as there's a handful of very good veteran cards that are definitely going to see play in competitive decks that are otherwise not very veteran themed. It will just be using very powerful veteran cards.
Is that a similar thought process, Birdo? They're just not, it's first expansion, first time they're introducing the keyword, so they haven't quite gotten to that critical mass of, I can truly build a straight up veteran deck now. They're more going to be sprinkled into other pieces that are currently happening.
Yeah, I think similarly, and I also think that probably one of the cards Jking has in mind that I have in mind as well is the 7 Schützen, which I think is probably one of the best veteran cards that has been shown, and probably will make a few waves, which I am excited to see.
And we'll bring these cards up on screen so you have a little bit of a reference point as we kind of dive in and go through them. But with the list that the two of you provide, we'll flip back to Jking for this one. Is there one card out of that list that you're like, this one, I want to talk about this one. I think this one's going to be important. I think this one's going to impact the meta. Is there one you really want to highlight?
I think the card I want to highlight above everything else is the Matsumoto Regiment. I love this card so much, and I think this is, at least immediately, I think this is going to be one of the single most impactful cards from the expansion.
And I think for me, the card I particularly want to highlight is Protect the Pocket, just because it's such a wild and powerful effect that I don't think we've really seen much like it, apart from maybe Commonwealth, of a card having such a large impact immediately when you play it.
I want to dive into Protect the Pocket because there's a lot going on in that card. But Matsumoto Regiment, let's just dive into that quickly first because I think it's a little bit more straightforward as to the reason behind it. Jking, you want to walk us through maybe where that fits in, though it might be obvious to some looking at this card or walking through it. If you're listening from an audio perspective, it's a 3-credit Japan card. It's a 3/4 infantry unit. Deal 1 damage to the enemy HQ when a destruction effect triggers.
So something I'd like to highlight immediately, because I think maybe some players haven't noticed this, is it's when a destruction effect triggers, not when a friendly destruction effect triggers. So this will also be triggering off of your opponent's destruction effects, which can lead to some pretty wild games. However, what I really like about this is it's essentially lets you run 2 additional copies of Signal Regiment if all of your other units are destruction units. And if you pair this with maybe Soviet Ally, where a lot of the destruction units are summoning additional units, you can really stick on the board while dealing a ton of burn damage through destruction effects, as well as the Japanese destruction effects like Birdo, Akita. These are going to just be burning through your opponent's health, but without. Previously, we've seen Jaggro burn decks require cards like Air Blitz, or maybe Imperial Strength, where you're running these orders that essentially just deal damage to the enemy HQ. You can build a burn deck virtually exclusively through units that are good in of themselves. And maybe the destruction effects are going to help you control the board, like the new Recon unit that's coming out. So I just really looking forward to this deck. I think Matsumoto is going to really be one of the key cards in this deck because it allows you to turn all of these powerful early game destruction effects in Japan and probably Soviets into burn damage while controlling the board.
And so with, Feigned Retreat moving out into the reserve pool, could this kind of be that next iteration of sort of that Jaggro style deck where, we're going to run the Akitas and all that. We'll have the Signal Regiment in it. We'll have Matsumoto in there for additional damage. We'll slap Soviets on as a potential ally instead of Germany and just kind of do a little bit more burn damage?
Yeah, I find it really interesting because Jagro's at a bit of a crossroads right now where traditionally Jagro has always been paired with Germany just because of the strength of turn 1 cavalry or bicycle regiment into turn 2 35T. And it's just incredibly powerful. And then later, because of Arado drawing Feigned Retreat, and you could still use Arado to draw Enigmas and maybe sprinkle in a couple expansions in there for additional draw if you feel the need for it. And that is probably still a very solid deck. But I think because Germany has essentially no destruction effects that you can pair with Matsumoto, it does make you look at other allies, especially Soviets. And then for draw, I think you're looking at 2 copies of 5-Year Plan as the best draw in that deck. And then if you're running that, maybe you want to run the new Island defense card where you get to heal and draw if you've taken a bunch of damage. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of very interesting choices. Maybe you want to run T80 in there, where the destruction effect hurts you, but it will also hurt your opponent and let you draw with Island Defense sooner. A lot of interesting choices with Soviet Ally, which is going to be taking Jaggro in a very different direction. But there's still going to be people who love their 35Ts on turn 2. So I'm sure we'll still see a lot of that as well.
Absolutely. Just adds a bit of variety. And it's also the interesting concept, like you were talking about, where typically Jaggro will run, the Arado will run the minimal amount of orders, 2, maybe 3. Let's not start that argument right now. But that Arado would allow you to draw. But now you have the flexibility. If I'm not hunting for a Feigned Retreat through the Arado, I can kind of go in and play more orders and try different things and mix it up. So I am very curious to see what direction it goes. I think to your point, Jking, there'll always be those purists who try and continue down that traditional Jaggro theme, but I think there's a lot of flexibility here, given the Matsumoto Regiment and the potential of the Soviet ally. Protect the Pocket now. Now, Birdo, Okay, let's for your audio listeners out there, 10 credits, Germany, order, protect the pocket, draw 4 cards. If you have 4 units with active pincer, end the next enemy turn immediately.
Yeah.
Walk me through
it. This effect only requires you to play 2 cards with pincer and have 2 other units on the board. So that, I think, immediately is really important to recognize that you need 4 cards out there, and it is 10 credits, so that means you do need to set up beforehand. Your opponent has a chance to deal with those units, which I think is really important for a card like this and an effect this powerful. Your opponent does have options to play around it, but if you're able to keep them off of destroying those units, or maybe they make a mistake, they don't value destroying your units well enough in this deck, then you're just really running away with the game. Drawing 4 cards plus ending their turn immediately is just such a powerful effect. You're able to take the front line. You're able to deal lots of damage. If you have the bonus credits, if you are using pincer effects that reduce the credit cost to operate, I think that this card really is everything you want to see in a top-end finisher.
And the thing about, to your point, Birdo, pincer cards as well, is they're not excessively expensive. You don't need to spend turn after turn trying to set this up. Sure, you need a few bodies on the board, but you can drop your pincer cards in one turn and then drop this the next turn, essentially. So you are really forcing your opponent to make some sort of move to limit the amount of pincer units on the board.
Absolutely. Even if you don't run it in your deck, your opponent has to think about it on ladder.
That's the interesting part as well. And I think it goes back to Kelly's point around the veteran cards too. Like, you're now forcing your opponent to make decisions. They have to react to your plan. They can't just go about doing their own thing and punching you in the face. Like, they need to make a decision around how they want to approach the next turn of the game to potentially stop your strategy. So, Keli, I'm curious because this card is obviously there's a lot going on. What was the thought process around putting this one together? Is there, and I know you're big on, keeping this thematic and the lore behind it. How did this card come together in the development process?
Well, this was definitely one of the cards that where the design was driven more by the needs of specific mechanics rather than drawing from history. As the guys have pointed out earlier, there hasn't been really a dedicated pincer deck, or at least not very good ones in the past. And one of the things we wanted to try to achieve with this expansion was to make the pincer deck more viable as a choice to play. And so one thing we definitely wanted to include in there, besides of course some pincer units, was sort of pincer payoff cards, which we hadn't really had any before. I mean, we've only been focusing on the pincer units themselves. So we decided we wanted a couple of sort of payoff cards for the pincer mechanic to sort of entice people into at least try these decks out, and this is one of them. The other is the Soviet infantry, the 91st Astragan, which grows every time you pincer it, and is very potent in a dedicated pincer deck. And this sort of is on the other end as a reward card if you get to start your turn with 4 pincered units on the board and 10 credits. You can do some crazy stuff. So this card actually was the initial design version of this was a lot worse and a lot less interesting. If I remember correctly, it was a lot cheaper and was limited rarity, and it only gave all your pincered units some fixed attack buff and drew you a card or something like that. It just was not very exciting as a payoff card. So we decided to do something a bit crazier there and went for this version, which went through several iterations before we finally ended on this one. I would say purely from power standpoint, this card could probably cost 8 credits, just purely on how powerful it is. But ending the enemy turns, this is one of the sort of, we are entering then this territory of being frustrating experience for players, and we know from other mechanics that we've done in the past that enter a territory like draw denial, resistance, discard, and stuff like that. That a lot of players are not very fond of those kind of experiences. So and same with stealing units and so on. So what we usually then do is we sort of overprice them a little bit. So as I say, I mean, from pure power level, this could cost 8, but we decided to go for 10 just to reduce, because the goal with the pincer deck is not to make it a tier 1 deck, and I definitely don't think it is a tier 1 deck. I think you can build a solid, maybe tier 2 deck out of it, but it's not going to be a lot stronger than that, and we didn't want to push it much harder than that. But this is still can be in the right situation an extremely powerful card if you manage to set it up correctly, and a lot of fun to when you manage to get it off. But and the pincer deck is actually one of the decks that I have had probably the most fun playtesting. It is the definition of a glass cannon deck. I mean, it can snowball really hard, but it's also very easy to disrupt it. So it's a bit similar to Alpine in that sense. So I think because of course most of the Alpine cards are rotating out, this pincer deck can sort of be the natural sort of take its place as a similar kind of play style. And probably at similar power level. So, yeah, I mean, I will be interested to see how people will try to break this, whether they try to ramp very quickly up to this, or just have it as a sort of a nice top end play that sometimes goes off and sometimes not. So yeah, it's going to be a very interesting card to monitor.
I just want to make it clear, Keli, that when you jump on a podcast with Jking and Birdo and say, I don't know if this can be a tier 1 deck, it's probably a tier 2 deck, that's actually a challenge you just put out there. I just want to make that clear, that that means they're going to try and figure it out. So good on you for putting that out there, and I'm excited to see what comes of the new pincer lists. Now, Jking, let's dive into the 158th Bushmasters. Now, 5 credit, 2 operating cost, US infantry, 3/6. When a unit is fully repaired, deal damage to a random enemy equal to damage repaired. What caught your eye on this one?
So we've seen a lot of cards in this expansion that are supporting this repair archetype for USA, and we've seen 1 or 2 cards that sort of support this in the past, but this expansion, this seems to definitely be like the main dedicated theme for US in this expansion. And I think the viability of this deck completely relies on Bushmaster. How strong is Bushmaster going to be? Because the effect seems pretty insane. If you just read the card, look at the stats, I mean, 3/6 body, that's not incredibly easy to remove, especially on turn 5. And the effect is going to just absolutely demolish your board if you let them get off any big repair turns. And this also encourages the US deck to actually damage their units more than just, say, Winter Warfare, to damage everything for 1 and then heal everything back up. Because Bushmaster will essentially just become a really big commando that's dealing 1 damage to everything. So maybe you want to run the new Enemy at the Gates Soviet card. Also, it means if you're playing against the repair deck, you can't just throw out, say, like a carpet bomb in. I mean, you probably don't want to do that to begin with anyways, but now there's always the fear that they're just going to play Bushmasters and then heal for 3 health on 5 different units, and suddenly you're taking 15 damage. And we've seen such an overwhelming mass of repair cards that I think there was definitely questions on to which ones you run. I don't think you just throw all of them in the same deck. I think there's no question about Bushmasters. I think every single repair deck is going to have Bushmasters in it. So I'm very excited to see just how high up that tier list repair US can get.
Yeah, the Bushmasters absolutely feel like the payoff card or one of the payoff cards in that deck. Now, I am curious because Birdo did pick out a US order here, 5 credit night bombing that says destroy target undamaged unit, then randomly rearrange units on the battlefield. So Jking, to your point, you go, you heal up your units, and then night bombing comes out, destroys one of them, and then randomly rearranges enemy units on the battlefield. Sorry, Birdo, what is going on here? And why is this important?
I just love the disruption of it. And I may get some threats in the mail after this, but I'm particularly excited to run it in USA France unitless. As another I can see Jking putting his head down into his hands. It's a deck that I really like. It's a deck that I think does have a lot of strategy to it, even if it is a little grindy and a little torturous to play against sometimes, depending on your deck. But I love destroying an undamaged unit. I think that's generally where you want a targeted destroy a unit order to go in the first place. And the rearrange enemy units on the battlefield, that's all gravy. You get to really mess around with your opponent's plans sometimes. Sometimes it's pretty low impact, but I'm excited to see, maybe some Jaskos to end up in the front line,
I literally picture this, Birdo, as you playing this card and then reaching over to the other side of the board and just doing this, mixing everything around. Like, that's literally what I'm picturing here. It's interesting, though, because to your point, Birdo, just like a 5 credit order that says destroy target undamaged unit is like, that's a good card. And then mixing everything up, that's like you said, that's just a bonus. And then I have to ask you, Keli, where did this come from? Where did your team decide we just need to rearrange everything that goes on the battlefield right now?
Well, one of the themes of the expansion was the position matters consideration, where it mattered a lot if unit had adjacent units or not, and who was positioned where and so on. And there are powerful cards in the set and also just in the old sets that care a lot about those things. So this just came out of us thinking, okay, how can we disrupt that in the craziest way possible? And this card came about, and maybe just a quick caveat. I mean, we had this artwork, which is an awesome artwork, and something we definitely wanted to use on an elite order, and when we had this effect, it sort of made perfect sense to use this image and call it night bombing, just because he's working in the night there. But it breaks my heart a little bit of how ahistorical we are in terms of that the US now has night bombing and the British has daylight bombing, because historically it was exactly the other way around. But it is what it is. But yeah, I mean, this card originally cost 6 and could destroy any unit. It was fine like that. It was basically then Blade of the Samurai with a little bit of a crazy potential upside, but not really exciting. So we decided to make it a bit more aggressive and reduce the cost by 1, but then also inserted the undamaged clause to not make it too much of an upgrade on Blade of the Samurai.
And Birdo,
but maybe one quick thing I want to throw in here. I found it really interesting when you presented me with the list of the cards that the guys had chosen, and the 3 first cards that we discussed are all payoff cards of specific strategies. I found that really interesting. The Matsumoto was specifically designed as a payoff for destruction deck, and the Bushmasters as a payoff for the repair deck, and the protected pocket as a payoff for the pincer deck. So it's interesting that they decided to choose the payoff cards for all these strategies.
And I think on top of that, something else that's interesting is every time Jking picks out a card, he's like got the strategy, what I want to do with it, what deck it goes in, and Birdo just picks chaos every time.
It's just fun. It's just fun.
It is.
I'm very curious, Keli, how you feel about when Birdo brings up night bombing. The first thing he says is, "This is support for unitless."
It makes me run to the list I'm working on for the next rotation.
I will add something though, that while you did mention, Birdo, that night bombing, the rearranging enemy units is a bit of gravy, but like there are situations where that is definitely helpful, right? Moving that smoke screen unit for the back row to the front line that you can go and knock out or stuff like that. Like there are uses for it, but just, the random aspect makes it not super duper reliable. That's all.
I'm ready to see Birdo play this on day 1 of the expansion coming out, and his opponent has a big 8/8 5th Rangers in the front line, which Birdo night bombs, and then it randomly rearranges their entire support line into the front line to get out of like Stars and Stripes range.
It will happen.
And it is worth noting that this night bombing card, I think the rearranging effect is actually less important for the unitless deck compared to other decks, because unitless is so reliant on keeping the board completely clear that that aspect I think will be more relevant in decks maybe like Ramp or other more mid-rangey decks that might just run night bombing.
Yeah, more mid-rangey, less toxic, whatever. Those decks. I wanted to keep the momentum going. Jking, you had picked the BM-13N US-6. It's a Soviet artillery 2/2, 3 deploy, 1 operating cost. Retreat this unit before damage is applied when it is attacked. That's a pretty nifty ability.
Yeah, so I really like this card. I see it as it reminds me of Night Witches in a couple of ways. Since it's this little bit of removal that you can play from your hand, and it's not exactly the most efficient removal ever, but it's the fact that you can, if your opponent is not able to remove this with an order, it will just keep going back to your hand over and over and over. Or maybe they don't even want to spend the credits to send it back to your hand and they just leave it on the board, in which case you just get to deal 2 damage over and over and over. And I mean, 4 credits to deal 2 damage is not great, but 4 credits to deal 2 damage infinitely is really, really good. And I have my choice opinions about Comet, but I think this is also a little bit like a small Soviet Comet in some ways, because it can also just go face. And if your opponent can't deal with it, if you get your opponent down to say 10 health, you can just start playing this and attacking them in the HQ. And they either have to finish you off or find a way to actually destroy this unit. So it's a card that is pretty inefficient on its own, but it actually punishes people for not running removal. And as we've seen from the meta that has lasted for 2.5 years now, some decks run a lot of removal, like Red Air with their air superiorities, Empire Strikes could take this out, self-damage. But other decks like, say, Jagro or Frontline run very, very, very limited removal. And I really like that there's cards like this that can really punish those decks, because a 2/2 Blitz arty that you can play every turn would be particularly good into those slower infantry-based aggressive and mid-range strategies like Jagro and Frontline.
Well, and like you said, it's 4 credit for 2 damage. but it's also forcing your opponent to respond. Otherwise, it just hangs out there and keeps pinging them. And if they do respond, then they're spending credits and they're, using their units and having to be kind of that distraction or having them think through what they're trying to do. And Keli, I'm going to go back to you for this because I think you've highlighted this a few times as sort of one of the main key pieces of this expansion is like you actually have to think about what you want to do and you're forcing your opponent to react a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to continue the thoughts you've been having on this, I mean, there absolutely are cases, for instance, where you are deliberately attacking into the unit to return it to the enemy hand, just to sort of force them to be spending the credits again, where you're sort of using it as a tempo gain of a sort, so deciding how to deal with it, when to deal with it, and so on, can be a very interesting choice. Maybe you don't even kill it immediately when you can, because you rather want the enemy to be spending his turns replaying this again and again, because he might be then just be falling more and more behind, depending on the matchup. So that also is something that people should notice, that yes, they are going to be very happy when the enemy attacks into this and it returns to your hand, but you might be playing into the enemy's hand by doing so. He might be sort of luring you into replaying it again and again. So it's something for people to consider. But yeah, I'm really happy with how this card came about, because I think it sort of is a perfect marriage of theme and functionality. There are many reports from the war of how frustrated the Germans were in trying to sort of catch the Katyushas, that the base strategy that the Soviets used was to sort of launch massive attacks with them and then basically just drive off immediately, and it made it very hard for the German counter batteries to catch them. And this sort of reflects that in a very, I feel, cool way of they come down and shoot you, but you have a very hard time catching them. So yeah, I think this card is gonna see a lot of play.
Absolutely fits the theme. I totally agree. Birdo, the next card you selected was Diplomatic Attache. So it's a 1 credit, a Japan order. Deal 1 damage to target enemy +1 for each previously played Diplomatic Attache.
Yeah, so I love when we get good standards into the game that really have a lot of potential without maybe being as high of a cost to build around as specials or elites. And I think Diplomatic Attache can really be a potent card in decks with a lot of draw. Something like Japan-France with Phony War, or even you can play this in a Britain deck with a lot of draw. You can even run double strength with Diplomatic Attache for the dream of dealing 5 and 6 damage with Diplomatic Attaches. So I love what this card can do. I love how order doubling it right now and in the future makes this card really interesting, not just for now, but for years to come. Potentially in classic mode, one day Diplomatic Attache will be the #1 meta deck for the format, completely destroying it. But of course, that is all very distant speculation right now.
All right, producer Mark, put that in the reminder for the podcast. In 3 years, we'll check in on Birdo's prediction and see where we're at with Diplomatic Attache. And now the last card that the gents had selected, we've got Gambit here. So it's a Soviet order, 5 credit. Both players add the unit with the highest cost in their hand to their support line. J King, what are you doing with this one?
So I think when a lot of people saw this card, their immediate thought is to similar cards like, say, Machines of War or Western Allies or Special Assignment, where it's these big expensive cards that pull a big expensive card from your deck or your hand onto the board as essentially just credit cheat. Get out something really big quickly. And while you certainly can use it like that, it does pull the highest cost card from your hand. So if you have a Joseph Stalin, a 272nd, something big you want to get out, you can certainly pull it out with Gambit. But what I really, really love about this card and what makes it more than just a credit cheat for like kind of a high roll kind of situation is it's also pulling a card from the opponent's hand. So this actually becomes a very valuable tool in just control decks in general because you can pull out your opponent's most valuable card and then kill it. So for example, if you're playing against German control, you're building a board, maybe you're going for some Soviet France, you have a Rima, big mobilized units in the support line, and you know your opponent's going to pull down a Leopold pretty soon. You just play Gambit because odds are if Leopold's in their hand, it's the most expensive card in their hand. And then you can say hammer it on the board and it prevents them from getting the deployment effect of it. However, there's also some risk to it because maybe you play Gambit and it pulls down a King Tiger instead of the Leopold, and then they play Leopold protected by King Tiger, and then you're completely screwed. And it also brings into question on your deck building because a lot of oftentimes the most expensive card in a Soviet control's hand is the ISU, the 9-cost destroy all damaged units. And you probably want to be using that for the deployment effect, so you don't really want to Gambit that out. So does that mean you run the Joseph Stalin, so you have a 10-cost unit to pull out? Or do you start cutting ISUs because you're favoring Gambit? Because I do think Gambit has a lot of potential to be run in competitive Soviet control decks, and I think it is a pretty big brain card. We're going to see some hilarious plays with this, and we're also going to see some crazy mind games with this card, I think.
Birdo, you had a big smile on your face the entire time Jking walked through that card. I'm just picturing the wheels turning in your head around how you want to have just the best time using this.
Well, what I wanted to say was, have you considered that in my unitless deck, I'm going to tech in Super Fortress so that when you play it, I have Super Fortress with no other way to play it onto the board.
I won't lie. When Jking started talking about this, I immediately thought about Birdo's unitless deck, being like, you know what? This is actually not terrible. Like you said, Jking, force something onto the board and then just kill it. It's very annoying.
No, it'd be pretty good against unitless. Yeah, get to pull out the Hellcats and things and to finally be able to use the removal in your hand on it.
The things that we will see come in the coming days and weeks. Those were the cards you two wanted to run through. As we kind of get to wrapping up the podcast, I guess we'll let's start with you, Jking. Any final thoughts about the expansion? Any specific deck or archetype you're really excited to play or really excited to mess around with?
So I really love the expansion. I think the team did a very good job at the theming. I really like all of the positioning matters cards. I think just as a whole, even if you're not running them, the fact that they exist in the game as a whole, it does require you to think more than just, oh, it's Japan bombing raid. Now there's so many more cards that matter with positioning. Some you want specific cards next to each other, some you don't want cards next to each other at all. And just really good job theming. And the deck I'm going to be playing day one on ladder is definitely going to be Japan Soviet Destruction. I think that deck looks super fun, but also I'm very excited for the future of a couple of different control decks, most notably Britain control and Soviet control. I think Soviets has a couple of very fun elites. As you can see, I picked 2 of them. I think Soviets are looking very fun in this expansion.
So, Birdo, beside your unitless deck, what else will you be playing on day one of the expansion?
I'm really excited about Pincer. I really want to see if Protect the Pocket can work. And even if it's not really a card that works in general, it will be fun to play it against some people and have it work out once in a while.
Right on. Keli, any last words for the cards community before Brothers in Arms is fully released across the board?
Yeah, I mean, I'm of course experiencing heavily now the normal jitters one always has just before a release, where you're sort of questioning your every choice and second guessing every decision. But I mean, I've been in this long enough to know that that's just normal. But hopefully, I mean, the most I'm hoping for is that nothing is super broken in terms of functionality. And the second thing is that nothing is super broken in terms of balance. Those are my two great hopes I have. But I think, I think the expansion will definitely shake things up a lot. I mean, I know that some people who have grown very fatigued with the existing meta probably would have liked even more shake-up, but I mean, it's only so much that one can do without doing some crazy power creeps. But yeah, I think people will have a lot of fun toys to play around with in the new expansion, and I'm also excited to see how we can take some of the seeds that we have planted in this expansion and grow them more in the future, especially the veteran mechanic, which we are definitely going to continue to develop. I mean, Jking is correct, 100% correct when he says that there isn't really a dedicated veteran deck in there right now, but I'm very confident that we will have one down the road. And our main focus in this expansion was not to necessarily have that as a must to have a dedicated veteran deck from this expansion, but more of just lay the groundwork but then have a few sort of powerful individual veteran cards in there that would see some play so people can sort of get familiar with the whole concept.
And that's the beauty of having the reserve pool now as well. I know it can be, a little bit of a love it or hate it type of thing, but it definitely creates more space for you to be able to build out new archetypes and use new keywords and things like that. So I, for one, am excited to see just the future of cards with this new expansion, with the mix-up of the meta. If you are still in love with the current meta, we do have one more event, June 25th. We've got the top 8 of the Cards Open that is happening on Sunday. So tune into that. Otherwise, the next time around, we're going to have something brand new, hopefully, to show you in the next OCC. So do not miss it. We have Brothers in Arms releasing on the 27th. Thank you so much, Jking. Thank you, Birdo. Thank you, Keli, for coming and joining us. Next month, we will be back to the traditional format. Elin will be here. We will discuss all the fallout from Brothers in Arms.